Hello, my name is Julia Schleck, and I'm an Associate Professor of English at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Today I'll be giving you the lecture entitled Traveling in the Renaissance, Christian and Islamic Lands. My research focuses on English travel narratives in the Renaissance or early modern period. Today I'll be describing some of those sources to you and their reception in England at the time, and particularly the ways in which the differences described in these accounts contribute to our understanding of the history of race and racism in Europe at the time. I'll be dividing my talk into 4 sections. 1. An overview of the types of travel accounts and other sources printed in England and Europe more broadly, which purported to describe Muslims and the lands in which they lived. 2. A discussion of their reception, in England in particular, with an eye to whether they were considered true or not. 3. A brief survey of the ways in which race and racial difference is conceived in the period. And 4. Some general comments on the ways that we are now attempting to study these topics in Renaissance early modern studies, which are comparatively new to the field. So to start right off with part 1. There are a wide variety of English sources from this period which describe Muslims and the lands where Islam is practiced. Some of these are only in manuscript, but many are printed and available as PDFs from major archives, and some have now been reprinted in modern editions. I've included some of the modern printed editions, generally anthologies, which are useful for teaching purposes, in the bibliography I provided. I find it easiest to group these different texts into different genres and subgenres, depending on whether the sources make claims to be true or are clearly literary in nature, and whether an author's had first-hand knowledge or not. In other words, whether he was a traveler. And if he was a traveler, why was he traveling? So I keep referring to the authors and the travelers as he, because in this period it describes the vast majority of our extant sources. But it is worth noting that it does not describe all of them. So women were strongly discouraged from traveling in this period. And I've included as a description of that this chart from Thomas Palmer's pamphlet, An Essay of the Means to Make How to Make Our Travails into Foreign Countries the More Profitable and Honorable, which was published in London in 1606. And so he includes as part of the chart the people that are inhibited travel, like those who should not travel. So there are those who by nature were made inappropriate for traveling, which included infants and decrepit persons. Those who had imperfections, which made it unwise for them to travel, like fools, madmen, and lunatics, and those whose sex make it inappropriate for them to travel, namely women. So most women did not travel, but some did, and here, for example, is one of the most notable, I would say, female travelers in the Renaissance. This is Catalina de Arazo, otherwise known as the Lieutenant Nun. She's a Spanish woman who as a child was placed in a convent, who early on escapes and cross-dresses as a man, travels to the Spanish territories in the Americas, and has a life as a conquistador before she is exposed as a woman. She does it herself in an effort to get out of being executed, and then returns to Europe, meets the Pope, and is given a special dispensation to go on living out as a man if she wishes, as she does. She eventually returns to Central America, and as far as we know, lives out her life there, living as a man, working as a mule driver somewhere in Panama. So there's a recent collection of scholarly essays discussing women's travel in the Renaissance, which I've included on your bibliography. And that said, most of the travelers and authors that I'll talk about here today are men. So I'll begin with the authors who traveled and who made truth claims for their narratives about foreign places and peoples, and then say a few words about works by non-travelers and literary sources. So a form of travel that was inherited from the medieval period and remained popular in the Renaissance was the pilgrimage. Medieval pilgrimage sites within Europe, like Santiago de Compostela or Rome, still attracted many devout travelers from across Europe, who went there as a destination or who stopped there on their way to more distant locations. Within Catholicism, as well as within Islam, traveling to holy sites was seen as a religious duty to be undertaken if possible. There were major movements of travelers across North Africa and the Middle East, as well as across the Indian Ocean, seeking to complete the Hajj to Mecca. Similarly, Christians from across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East journeyed to Jerusalem and the collection of sites known as the Holy Lands. Pilgrimage was a devout undertaking for Christians, but it was complicated by the Reformation and skepticism of Protestants towards relics and Catholic ritual. Catholic control of some of these sites or of the pilgrimage routes and the guides for them also made it a less desirable enterprise for Protestants. However, both Protestants and Catholics continued to travel to the Holy Land, whether they chose to think and write about such travel as pilgrimage or not. And I've included here a collection of essays on travelers to the Holy Land, and this is also in your bibliography. Some of the more notable English travelers to the Holy Land included an extremely grouchy Protestant pastor named John Cartwright and a lively Scot named William Lithgow. And here he is. Get my head out of the way. Lithgow walked all the way from Scotland to Jerusalem and beyond. He also got caught up in the Spanish Inquisition on the way home, who took a dim view of his Protestantism, which he describes in harrowing terms that remind us that waterboarding is a very old form of torture. Now, parts of both of these accounts are included in some of the anthologies in your bibliography. So the most prevalent form of travel in the period, however, was undoubtedly trade. After trading primarily with the lowlands and with Spain during the medieval period, in the Renaissance, English traders began heading further into the Mediterranean, stopping at Italian, Greek, Egyptian, and other ports directly rather than getting these goods passed through continental hands. In the mid-1550s, French traders sought and successfully got privileges from the Ottoman Sultan to control the European trade in Ottoman domains. And in the 1580s and 1590s, the English successfully horned in on this privilege and established a regular independent trading network to the Eastern Mediterranean, run by one of the earliest joint stock trading corporations, the Levant Company, Levant being the name for the eastern side of the Mediterranean. At this time, Ottoman domains included the entire Mediterranean coastline, all the way from Greece and the Balkans, as you can see there, across the Levant and Egypt, and pretty much all of North Africa, except for Morocco. So those who traveled for trading purposes wrote extensive accounts, not for public circulation, but for those inside the company. However, many of these were collected by a man named Richard Hakluyt, a priest with close ties to London merchants, who published them all in a massive collection known as the Principal Navigations of the English Nation. The principal navigations include accounts of travel not only by traders and not only to the Mediterranean, but it does have a very extensive materials by traders to that area. It also prints some of the early English trading attempts along the west coast of Africa prior to the start of the transatlantic slave trade. They're interesting reading in part because the English are seeking trade partners for goods and not slaves until much later in the period. So you get kind of one early slaver in the 1550s, but it takes the English a while to get into that, at least another century. The main enemies at this point in these accounts are the Portuguese. And the Portuguese, of course, had successfully established trading ports along the west coast of Africa a full century before this. As you can see, it's in the 15th century. They make it around the Cape of Good Hope and go up the east side of Africa and establish a presence in the tip of India there, primarily in Goa. The English would eventually follow the Portuguese, as would the Dutch, who became major trading rivals of the English in the East Indies. The British East India Company was established in 1601, and the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, was established around the same time. These travelers left substantial records, but most are still in archive form, although some are online. In English, the accounts collected by Hakluyt remain the best source, along with the slightly later anthology of travels put together by the preacher Samuel Purkis. So here's a shot of the cover page of the original printing of Hakluyt's Principal Navigations, and this is Samuel Purkis's Pilgrims. The Pilgrims is a huge collection of heavily edited travel accounts from the period. They're organized geographically, so if you were looking for some good tales, Purkis is a good place to go, and it has an extensive table of contents. It was reprinted a number of times throughout the 16 teens and 1620s. Both Purkis and Hakluyt were printed in modern editions in the early 20th century in multi-volume collections. So these can be found in many libraries, and they're now locatable online as well because they're well outside of copyright. As might be expected of traders, most of these accounts focus on navigation details, how to get there and back in the safest, quickest way, and on trading conditions in distant markets. But they have many lively episodes and descriptions of distant places as well. One account describes an English ship anchoring off the coast of West Africa, engaging in friendly trade with the people who came out to the shore to meet them. And then the English invited these African guests onto the ship for some evening food and entertainment. As an entertainment, they put on a play that was popular in London at the time that was called Hamlet, and it was enacted for their guests. It's unclear from the account what the guests made of it, but everyone parted friends at the end of the evening. The African trading partners left the ship, and the ship continued south. So the increasing frequency of English ships in the Mediterranean coincided with an increase in piracy as well, and many trading ships were taken by pirates, their goods seized, and their crews sold as slaves. If the pirates were based in North Africa, European ships were captured and the men and women were sold in North Africa. If the pirates were based in Europe, North African ships were captured and the men and women sold in Europe. This type of piracy and enslavement had taken place in the Mediterranean since ancient times, but it saw an increase in the Renaissance, particularly as pirate crews became multinational and multi-religious, and gleaned advanced sailing technologies from across many maritime countries. Pirates based in North Africa also began raiding the Atlantic coastline as far north as Iceland, landing near small villages and attacking and enslaving everyone they could capture. From the English perspective, this resulted in a massive number of English commoners working as common sailors on trading voyages or just living in coastal villages who were taken and enslaved in Africa. Higher-ranking merchants were ransomed, as were any nobility or gentry who happened to be on board. Commoners, however, were stuck, often for years, decades. Yet some managed to escape, or to save up enough funds to buy their freedom, and they published captivity narratives, as they're known, when they returned home to England. These detailed accounts of life in North African cities are frequently very fascinating and show a range of conditions of enslavement, which could be brutal, but could also be quite mild and humane. Some English who saw or experienced life in North Africa, either as slaves or travelers, chose to stay there voluntarily because the cleanliness and the quality of life, as well as the economic opportunities, were often greater than those available in England. Some of those people converted to Islam, an often attractive option which those returning to England were then accused of and had to defend themselves against, which they did in those narratives. I've included this excellent collection of English captivity narratives in your bibliography, Piracy, Slavery, and Redemption. This features also a very thorough introduction to the practice of piracy in the Mediterranean in this period. These are all English narratives. There's also a number of collections out there now which detail narratives from that were originally published in other languages too. So the Renaissance also saw the beginning of what would later be called the Grand Tour, in which wealthy young noblemen traveled abroad on a set course which included Italy and Greece, and usually also Jerusalem and Cairo. The genteel texts produced by such travelers, which in this period include men like George Sandys, who is the gentleman whose head is floating above mine, finds Morrison and Henry Blount and they're laden with classical references showing off the humanist education of these men and melding it with their first-person observations of famous sites from antiquity. So these texts are often published as large, high-quality books filled with expensive images. This one here is by George Sandys, A Relation of a Journey, begun in Anno Domini 1610. This was originally published in a quite large, beautiful format. You can see the woodcuts are very finely done there. So these are like the coffee table books of the early modern period. Similar to these individual travelers, but with considerably fewer funds, were what I think of as the oddball adventurers. On top of this list would definitely be the Shirley brothers, who journeyed to Persia for reasons that remain unclear. Here's one of them. And lobbied the Persian Shah Abbas I for closer ambassadorial and trading ties with Europe and England in particular, and returned to Europe in the capacity as official messengers or lower-level ambassadors from the Shah to the princes of Christendom. The two brothers each made the trip there and both returned in this capacity at different points. Robert Shirley, who's here on the left, returned briefly to England in the 16 teens and visited his king in Persian dress. You can see him here. He's wearing a turban with a cross on top of it, and he came accompanied by his Circassian Orthodox wife, Teresa, who is pictured here in English dress and is holding a pistol, which is perhaps a reference to one of the famous stories about Teresa and how she saved her husband from being killed by bandits on the roads in the Caucasus as they were traveling away from Persia. She's a pretty spectacular woman. Her biography is very interesting. So another even more adventurous English oddball, and this one is really odd, was Thomas Coryat. Coryat was a lesser nobleman who traveled all the way to India, much of it on foot, sending back bizarre, loopy reports to his acquaintances back in London. And as you can see here, this is one sent from India, where he's already been riding on an elephant and wishes to show everybody about that. Coryat never returned to England. He died in India in 1617, so only a year after this is published. But he clearly had some spectacular adventures along the way, which seemed to be his only rationale for traveling. Coryat is not the norm in this period. They don't get a lot of tourists. And part of the reason for that is that traveling in this period was a great travail, which is where the origins of the word came from. But it was possible for Christian travelers to find shelter and food within Islamic domains if they traveled overland or in cities where they landed, if they traveled by ship. The Ottomans in particular provided a series of khans or large buildings where travelers could shelter and often find water, and while Catholic and especially Protestant churches were few as you went east, there were other Christians and Christian churches there. The same was not true for Muslim travelers through Europe. There were no state-provided accommodations for travelers, and innkeepers were deeply suspicious and could refuse to house Muslim travelers. Halal food was impossible to find, and there were no mosques or groups of Muslims living in European cities, as European Christians were intolerant of them. However, some did make the journey, usually for ambassadorial reasons. This Moroccan ambassador, Abd al-Wahid bin Masoud bin Mohammed al-Nun, visited England in 1600, and he and his party may have provided some of the inspiration for the character of Othello. This Moroccan ambassador, on the cover here, Mohammed bin Hadoub, journeyed through France and the lowlands in the early 16th century and left an extended account of his travels, which has been translated into English, along with travel accounts by other Muslim and Middle Eastern travelers in this period, in this anthology here, which was translated and edited by Nabil Matar. One of the most curious, I think, in this collection is by an Iraqi Orthodox priest who journeyed from Iraq to Spain and then on to the Spanish Americas before returning home. This period also saw several real and fake ambassadors from Ethiopia or from the mystical Prester John, who showed up in Rome or other European courts. Some Muslim nobility were also captured and held in Europe as slaves, but were treated as more high-profile guests, most notably a man called Al-Hasan ibn Muhammad al-Wazan al-Fazi, known in Latin as Leo Africanus. Al-Wazan converted to Catholicism and took the name Leo after his owner/patron, Pope Leo X, with the descriptor Africanus of Africa. Al-Wazan spent around 8 years in Italy, during which time he wrote an extensive history of North Africa based on his travels across the region. It remains the most detailed and accurate history written in the region for at least a century, and it debunked many of the myths and erroneous claims of past European histories and was considered an authority for a long time. Although the evidence is somewhat uncertain, we believe Al-Wazan returned to North Africa in 1526 and 27 and reconverted to Islam. So a lively trade also took place between Mediterranean ports, particularly in Venice, whose territories bordered the Ottoman Empire and with whom it retained close, if uneasy, ties. There are many Italian accounts of traders and ambassadors in Istanbul, as well as a great deal of artwork. You may have seen this one before. This is a portrait of Mehmet II by the Italian artist Gentile Bellini. One scholarly work in this area that I'd call your attention to is particularly accessible and entertaining in the genre of what might be called early modern borderland studies with an interest in gender, is this one here by Eric Durstler called Renegade Women. It details 4 particular cases of women in Venice, Greece, or the Balkans, the latter 2 of which are controlled by the Ottomans in this period, as you recall on the map, and how they use their ability to cross back and forth between Venetian and Ottoman territories, between Christian and Muslim lands, to their advantage, and when trying to handle difficult economic or marital situations. So for them, the borders turned out to be a useful tool. So this brings us to sources that are not written by travelers, although they are informed by the travel of others. I'll go into these just briefly so that you know they're out there. I'll be happy to expand on them or offer any suggestions for modern printings in the Q&A if you're interested. First, there are histories, which can be quite extensive, like this one, Robert Knoll's General History of the Turks. This is like 500 pages or something and includes an enormous amount of beautiful engravings. It is essentially a kind of political history of the Ottoman Empire up until that point. There's also natural histories, which with extended collections of foreign plants and animals. Similar to these were maps and collections of maps, which often featured pictures of exotic animals. So you can see here there are some bears up in Russia and some lions down here in North Africa and Barbaria. And of course the always popular sea monsters over here. And sometimes these maps also depicted people in foreign dress, which you can see along the margins of this map. And they were often distinguished in their dress not only by nationality, but also by religion and by social status. So they can be found as well, not only on maps, but in printed books called costume books, which showed images of different types of people in their local dress. In this period, it's important to note that dress was a major marker of identity. One's religion, one's gender, and what today we would call one's class are all heavily marked by clothing. There are also what we would call fictional genres, which featured foreign lands and peoples. In England, this was especially true of stage plays or dramas. There's an interesting fascination, or rather an increasing fascination, with Moorish, Turkish, or Persian characters on the stage, and plays were often set in Istanbul or North Africa as well. This modern edition here, switch over. The Turk Plays has an excellent introduction written by its editor, Daniel Vitkus, and it reprints 3 of these. Another collection the three Renaissance travel plays, contains as its first the travels of the three English brothers, as you can see there. This is a fictionalized account of the travels of the Shirley brothers, whom I mentioned above. It played in London while they were still alive, although only one was in London at the time. These are all written by contemporaries of Shakespeare. There's also, of course, plays and poems in other national literary traditions, most notably a whole series of plays by Cervantes, which can be found in translation, which treat North African settings, characters, and themes. So the final types of publication that detailed foreign places were news reports. News had primarily been passed by private letter in previous eras, but in this period it becomes regularized and publicly printed, leading to some of the earliest newspapers in English. Throughout the period, the serialized publications were printed alongside longer one-off pamphlets which claimed to present some particular news in detail, and that's what we have here. And as you can see and as reflected in the illustration, these are reports of apparitions seen in the sky over the tomb of Muhammad, which perhaps presage a civil war in the Ottoman Empire, which would be seen as a positive thing from a Christian standpoint. And also a report of how it rained blood in Rome, which you can see coming down on the city there. So news pamphlets and serials made insistent claims on their veracity, but as you probably are not surprised to find, given the content of this particular pamphlet, they seem to have been widely doubted. And that was true even of kind of less fantastical news, just, news of battles that were fought and who won and that kind of thing. In an era today of so-called fake news, it's interesting to reflect on what led people at that time to believe that a story about a foreign place, whether written in an anonymous news pamphlet or published in an extended narrative by a traveler, would be regarded by people reading it as true. So in the next section of my talk, I'll consider what it meant to tell a true tale about a foreign land in the Renaissance. Welcome to part 2, where we're going to be looking at the reception of some of these travel narratives in England, and in particular, whether they were judged to be true or not. So what we mean by the word true is something that we often take for granted, I think. When we use the word, we usually assume that we as speakers share the same understanding of what that means with our listeners. However, what counts as true and the process by which something achieves the status of truth changes over time and can vary by culture. A good illustration of this is the word and concept of the fact. If we were in the same room right now, then I would ask someone for a definition of the word fact. And I'm guessing based on past discussions that it would be tied to science, or perhaps use the word evidence. It might refer to witness testimony. So facts tend to come up today in scientific and juridical contexts, where we think of them, in historian of science Lorraine Daston's words, quote, as particular rather than general, manifest rather than hidden, simple rather than complex. At its most typical, a fact is a discrete event, cleanly severed from those preceding and following it, an atom of experience. Although facts can be strung together in narrations like pearls on a chain, they can ideally also be unstrung and recombined into quite different narratives without losing their well-bounded, small-radius self-sufficiency." End quote. However, in the Renaissance, the word fact meant a deed, something done, as you can see here in the kind of first definition in the Oxford English Dictionary. The word fact comes from the French, into English from the French verb faire, to do or to make. The past participle of that was spelled F-A-I-C-T. And so you can see how we get the modern fact. Now, facts at this time had no special epistemological status. There could be true facts, there could be false facts, there could be foul facts. As, for example, the Earl of Warwick says in Shakespeare's Henry VI, "That can I witness, and a fouler fact did never traitor in the land commit." Or take the Duke of Buckingham's comment in the same play, "A naughty sort of persons, lewdly bent, have practised dangerously against your state, dealing with witches and with conjurers, whom we have apprehended in the fact." So the status of a fact as some small bit of information that is self-evidently true, if it is in fact a fact, is something that develops later. And if there are no facts in the period, then how did people then in the Renaissance determine what was true? Arguably in ways very similar to those we use today, although we tend not to think about it very much. Namely, we develop taxonomies of trustworthiness in the source that is giving us the information and extend our credibility accordingly. So some Americans today trust Fox News over the New York Times and vice versa. Some trust neither source and rely on web blogs. The QAnon phenomenon is a fascinating case for this right now. Some get their news only through networks of like-minded individuals on social media or late-night comedy shows. There's been a rapid decline as well in our nation's trust in quote-unquote experts who claim that mantle by virtue of education, training, title, job position, including doctors. As a society, we no longer agree on what constitutes a trustworthy source of information. Part of the way we individually make decisions about whose information to trust now is based on whether that person is telling us things that jive with our understanding of the world. That is more likely to happen when the source is someone who shares your religious beliefs, class assumptions, political views, and race, but not necessarily. This is sometimes called confirmation bias, which basically just means that we're more likely to receive as true a statement that confirms what we already know, rather than one that challenges our beliefs or assumptions about the world and how it works. So the early modern period operated in the same way, and can best be glimpsed through the status of witnesses. Those who had the greatest credibility under the law were those of the highest social status. Women, the poor, strangers, and non-Christians had decreasing levels of credibility. So when an amazing story about a distant land came to one's ears the question was who was telling the story. Since no one else could verify the tale at this distance, it was proverbial that travelers lied, then assessing the credibility of the speaker or writer was one of the only ways to decide whether something about a foreign land was true or not. Conflicting information about Muslims and Islamic lands were printed all the time, and traveler tales only added additional layers of confusion to that. So of the types of travelers I listed above, those gentlemen making the grand tour, whose tales were printed as big expensive coffee table books, were most likely to be extended the most credit. Merchants, who were wealthy but commoners, would come second. Poor sailors or servants who rarely wrote their own accounts but who would tell tales orally when they got home would come in closer to the bottom, and they would probably only be beat out by anonymous reports, which were literally better than printed rumors. As you may have noticed in this description, genre and medium also played a role in communicating credibility. An expensively printed, heavily illustrated book would carry more weight than a cheap pamphlet. This has become an issue again today, in which something that posts on the internet that looks like news and follows the conventions of news writing can gather a fair amount of credibility, certainly more than a sloppily edited, personalized post, yet the latter might be more factual in our modern sense. It just looks less factual. So early modern readers also had significant confirmation bias, especially insofar as something confirmed the universally understood truth of Christianity. A true story in this period might not look like anything that's true to us today, but to them, a tale that confirmed what they knew to be true, told by a high-status author, would be extended high credit. Similarly, one that tapped into a familiar frame, narrative frame, a story whose basic outlines is already known, but that gets retold in a new format, was popular then as it is today. So the practice of reusing illustrations across different pamphlets or books also contributed to the recognition and categorization of certain tales into certain familiar narrative frameworks. And this could also affect kind of the way that the actors and the stories would be told. So if you take a look at this is a news report. It features a woodcut. This is from the front cover. And it's reporting on a battle between the English forces and bumping into Turkish galleys. And so this is England versus Ottoman official navies. Keep that one in mind. And if you go, I'm going to skip ahead. This is a pamphlet. I hope you recognize the illustration. It's exactly the same one. It's been reused by the printer, only this time the two forces that are fighting, which you may have noticed still bear the cross, the Christian cross, and the Islamic crescent. Only now this is describing two fights between, or a fight between an English merchant ship and a pirate. So there's a kind of equivalency that is going to be drawn between the Royal Turkish fleets and the Ottoman fleets and the pirates here. And let me just go back up. So when it came to information about Islam and the land where it was practiced, there was of course the familiar crusade narratives in which Muslims, or Saracens as they were called in the Middle Ages, were fierce warriors opposing Christian knights, and Muslim women were extremely beautiful and frequently able to be converted and carried off by that same Christian knight. This gave way to more detailed information about the Ottomans in particular, who retained a reputation for fierceness in battle as appropriate given their continuing conquest of European territory throughout this period, and influenced by old tales of the Islamic afterlife, as well as new tales of the Sultan's harem for sexual lasciviousness and perversity. In England, these general ideas could be inflected with positive or negative connotations depending on the context. So from a traditional Christian standpoint, fierce Ottoman Janissaries conquering Eastern Europe was a bad thing. However, given England's enmity with and vulnerability to a more powerful Spain throughout much of this period, and the fact that Spain, or the Habsburgs more generally, were enemies with the Ottomans, it was often Habsburg territory that was getting threatened by the Ottomans, this meant that the English might find themselves allied with the Ottomans, who didn't threaten them, against Spain, who did. The same was true about Morocco, which proposed to Elizabeth I a military alliance against Spain. So after James I, however, made peace with Spain, that assessment changed. It certainly did for the monarch, and thus English foreign policy towards Islamic polities changed quite dramatically. But given the unpopularity of James's peace with Spain back in England, it perhaps didn't change so much for the general populace as it did for the monarch. So also along a military line, there were a spate of publications about English soldiers fighting in North Africa, but not as Christian knights fighting against the Saracens. Instead, in the wake of James's peace with Spain, soldiers had little way to make a living. England has no standing army at this point. So many soldiers became mercenaries for the warring kings in North Africa, and the stories touted the bravery of English knights in order to uphold England's reputation for fierce bravery, which Muslim soldiers had to acknowledge. So aspects of the old story remain the same, the invincibility of England's fighting men, but they're adopted to the times in a way that changed the positionality of the Muslims in the story. There's many news pamphlets and stage plays that featured brave English soldiers fighting in North Africa, including at the Battle of Alcazar, also known as the Battle of Three Kings, and that's the pamphlet that I put for you here. You'll notice at the very end there, it says it also features the death of Captain Stimuli, who was an English mercenary. However, this might shift again as the number of Englishmen captured and enslaved in North Africa grew, and the Barbary pirates, some of whose crews featured Englishmen who had converted and immigrated to North Africa, became fearsome and hated. There were several English soldiers who did this and became famous pirates, including one named John Ward. Ward was featured in a number of pamphlets and plays in the period, ones that often gave reasonably accurate descriptions of the piracy that he committed and the wealth that he gained by doing so, but then they veered off the rails in terms of veracity because they often ended with an account of his despair and his violent death through hanging or otherwise. He was filled with remorse at his choices and, was going to go to hell. But historically speaking, John Ward retired wealthily and happily in Tunis and lived to a ripe old age. So in this case, the wealth to be gained through interactions with Muslim lands and peoples is painted as a terrible temptation, which would cause one to lose one's soul. However, the wealth to be made in trading with the Ottomans would be depicted quite differently. Muslims could make excellent trading partners, and in that case their luxuries were a positive thing and not a slur on their collective character. As I noted in the description of some of the English trading voyages down the coast of Africa, in many of the travel narratives and dramatic works of the period, the enemy is not clearly the non-European other, whether that's the Turk or Moor, African, or Indian. Often the clearest enemy is a Catholic European, a Spaniard or a Portuguese, or eventually even Protestant co-religionists like the Dutch. So in accounts influenced by trade, Muslim characters had pretty varying profiles, featured as good or bad characters depending on the situation. So far, the primary axis of difference that I've noted is that of religion, Christian versus Islamic lands and actors. While this would certainly remain an important aspect of the hierarchies of human difference through which Europeans viewed the world, by the very end of the period that would be decisively overtaken by modern ideas of race. The early modern period saw a dramatic change in the meaning of this word and its function in European societies and in their interactions with other lands. So in the next section of my talk, I'll outline what race meant at the time and how it began to change. Welcome, this is part 3 of the lecture, in which I'm going to be talking about what race means in the early modern period. So every time I teach Shakespeare's Othello in one of my classes, there's at least one, and usually many students, who describe the title character as African American. And when he's called Black, it's clearly what my students have in mind is African American. This, of course, is historically and literarily incorrect on many levels, but it's indicative of the way in which 21st century readers bring with them a whole host of assumptions to what we would describe as racially different characters or historical figures, assumptions that are profoundly anachronistic but often completely unconscious. One of the things that greater engagement with a wider variety of sources from the period, and travel narratives in particular, led scholars to realize was that we were more or less doing the same thing. But racial difference, the very idea of race, even the word race, has not been at all stable across time. Race has a history, and in the Renaissance period, ideas about race were extremely different from our own, and not necessarily in ways we might expect. Research into the history of race as a concept and as a means of differentiating peoples into different groups, often hierarchically organized and used for purposes of political, economic, or cultural domination and exploitation, and how that plays out in the Renaissance is fairly recent in the field, and it's evolving rapidly. What I'd like to do here is give you a sense of the different questions that are being asked and the lines of inquiry being undertaken right now in the field. One of the earliest questions asked might be best summed up by the title of an essay published in 2002 by Helen Scott, Was There a Time Before Race? As you know, the Renaissance, or as it's more usually designated, the early modern period, conventionally runs from about 14 to 1700, with historians stretching that up to about 1800. European settlement of the Americas began only in the 1500s, but by the mid to late 1600s, the transatlantic slave trade from Africa to the Americas was in full swing, starting with the Caribbean and Spanish Americas, and later extending to North America as well. It's well known that African bodies were purchased to fill labor needs that could not be met by enslaved indigenous peoples who were rapidly dying from European disease or by indentured servants gleaned from the ranks of the European poor. And given our current experience of our modern plague, we can perhaps imagine somewhat more vividly what it would have been like for even highly sophisticated indigenous societies under the pressure of plagues that had like 80% death rates sometimes. For comparison, the current COVID death rate in the US is hovering at around less than 1%. So you can see the kind of societal collapse that they were experiencing. So early modern documents showed that racial difference as we conceive of it today was not present in the early modern period. As I noted before, differences were certainly noted, and skin color was among those, but the vocabulary, configuration, even the word race was so radically different as to make one wonder, as Scott does here, if there was, in fact, a time before race in some sense. So this led to questions of causality. We tend to generally assume that notions of racial difference, specifically the assumption on the part of Europeans of their racial superiority of white races over black races, was what enabled the mass enslavement, torture, and slaughter of so many men and women from Africa and their descendants. But what if the need for labor and the conditions of its acquisition and the work needed from those bodies came first, and was therefore instrumental in the development of racism? Perhaps the transatlantic slave trade caused racism in its modern form and not the other way around. The relationship between capitalism and racism is, of course, extremely complicated, and many scholars have now weighed in on the question, some pushing back quite hard against the argument that material conditions led to ideological ones rather than the other way around. And this is still a kind of open debate in the field as to what the relationship between these two things is. One turn that debate took was to trace the rise of what is called scientific or biological racism, in which ideas about racial difference were rooted in biology or other scientific or pseudoscientific disciplines, something that by the 19th century is in its full flower with things like phrenology, Darwinian evolution, and that kind of thing. The early modern period, by contrast, shows a distinct lack of what we would call scientific interest in tracking, cataloging, measuring, and otherwise studying in an orderly and mathematical way the various somatic differences between human bodies. Instead, as discussed above, the primary markers of difference were what we would describe as cultural, things like religion, food, dress. Modern race studies has posited a difference between the overtly scientific racism of the past and what they dubbed cultural racism of the present, in which racial inferiority is ascribed more or solely to cultural habits or features rather than to the bodies of racially different peoples. Early modern scholars have begun to consider whether the Renaissance might be best described as a period of cultural racism, which led to the later intensification of biological racism before shifting back again in the late 20th century. This distinction began to break down, however, when scholars considered what constituted scientific study in the early modern period. This is the age of the scientific revolution in which science as it is practiced today, a reliance on empiricism, the practice of experimentation, and so forth, slowly replaced older methods of what was by then called natural philosophy. Natural philosophy, as the name indicates, created knowledge about the natural world primarily through observation and philosophizing, often through Aristotelian logic. It happened in the study and not in the lab. Biology as a field did not exist, but medicine did, and interest in human anatomy shot up in this period. Theories about differences in skin color and in reproduction were grounded in the biology of the time, so to speak, in ways that I'll discuss more in a moment. And so it might make more sense to think of theories of racial difference as always grounded in the study of the human body, and to account for the dramatic changes in those theories through dramatic changes in the fields of medicine and human biology across time. So what were some of those theories in the Renaissance? Some of the earliest ideas about human difference in areas we now consider linked to race were inherited from the medieval period and grounded in geography. These are usually referred to as climactic theories of race. The idea was simply that observing that one's own skin color always grew darker the more time one spent in the sun, relative amounts of sun exposure accounted for differences in skin color between Northern Europe, the Mediterranean, and equatorial Africa. In the Middle Ages and well into the Renaissance, the Mediterranean color was seen as ideal, as a kind of golden mean between the pale, frigid wastes of Northern Europe, which those coming from the sophisticated Middle Eastern, North African, and Southern European societies considered simply barbaric, and the scorched or parched regions, as they were called, further south into the Saharan desert and beyond, where men were so burned by the sun as to be positively black and somewhat, therefore, possibly crazed through this excessive sun exposure. This theory about differences in skin color is still regularly cited in European sources up to the 1600s, and I've included a picture of this anthology that I've had up for a while because it's a wonderful collection of sources that discuss anything that is related to the concept of race as we now consider it in the early modern period. It has dozens and like 100 or something sources of little clips of longer texts, and most of the theories that I'm talking about here you can find some primary text that discusses it in this excellent collection, which also has a very long introduction, which expands on a lot of the points that I'm going to make here. So if you're interested in this period and this topic, I'd recommend it. It's edited, I'm sorry, my head is covering the authors, by Anya Lumba and Jonathan Burton. I'll make sure to put it on the bibliography as well. So the extensive global travels undertaken by traders and adventurers, however, is putting some serious pressure on this theory by 1600. Why were the peoples encountered in northern Canada more brown than white, given how far north they were? Why were Caribbean natives, whose islands lay directly on the equator, not as black as sub-Saharan Africans living at the same latitude across the ocean? How to account for the varieties of East Asian skin tones, which also did not map happily onto the clean African, Mediterranean, Northern European divide. So the greater mixing of peoples of different skin tone observable by Europeans, now that they were doing more traveling, also posed complications. If a black man married a white woman, and there were such marriages in this period as well as vice versa, and they lived in a northern climate, why wasn't the child born white? Particularly puzzling cases were reported of white women married to white men giving birth to black children, which were sometimes decided to be instances of what was called maternal impression. So pregnant women were thought to be highly impressionable during pregnancy in ways that could affect the outcome of the child. Such women needed to be kept well heated. Heat was important to get a male child, and generally happy and protected in order for that child, preferably a male child, to be born. If a vivid painting including the figure of a black man or woman were hung in the pregnant woman's room, extended gazing on the figure could impress the image upon the child in the womb and create a black child, among other things. So a white woman married to a black man could be presumed to be looking at him fairly continuously during her pregnancy, thus producing a black child, despite living in a northern climate. Therefore, maternal oppression could be the explanation for differences in skin color across the globe. Black women saw other black people and gave birth to black children, white women did the same, etc. More recent investigations on this topic have focused on what the word race actually meant in the period, and the implications this had for theories of somatic difference, as well as the gradual development of taxonomies of racial difference and superiority. The word race was found in numerous European languages of the period, and they all indicated differences in ancestry or social status. Rather, race was something that only those with illustrious and well-known ancestry had. Race was about bloodline. So a nobleman might come from a race of kings or a race of warriors, but a baker never came from a race of bakers or cobblers or blacksmiths, in part because those ancestries, those bloodlines, were just not tracked in any way by commoners. No one cared about the lineage of common people. So one might be tempted to simplify this by saying that race in the period was equivalent to class and was a social distinction not necessarily linked to the appearance of the body per se. However, as the word bloodline indicates, differences in social status were in fact seen as rooted in the body, specifically in the blood, and one's blood was often linked to particular characteristics rooted in the history of actions taken by others in one's bloodline. Some of these characteristics did overlap with characteristics later attributed to particular races in our modern sense of the term. So the idea of blood and bloodline also intersected with skin color, particularly in the Spanish context. The very beginning of this period saw the Reconquista, the reconquering of the Iberian Peninsula by Christian kings who centuries earlier had been conquered or pushed to the northern reaches of the peninsula by Islamic kings from North Africa. Under the rule of the Muslim Umayyad dynasty, as in most Muslim-ruled empires in both the medieval and early modern period, Muslim, Christians, and Jews were all recognized as so-called people of the book and allowed to live peaceably and practice their own religion within its domains. They were by no means equal. Christians and Jews were second-class citizens and had to pay extra taxes, but they were tolerated and viewed as legitimate subjects of empire. After the Christian Reconquista of the peninsula, the Spanish sought to push out, convert, or kill all non-Christian inhabitants. This was the work of the Inquisition, as you saw with William Lithgow earlier. Part of this centered on bloodlines. Newly converted Christians, known as Moriscos, those who had converted from Islam, and Marranos, those who had converted from Judaism, were suspect and came under heavy surveillance and sometimes persecution by Christian authorities. Eventually, in 1601, the Spanish expelled the Moriscos to North Africa, even though many of those families had lived in Iberia for centuries and had no ties to North Africa. In this situation, bloodline or race becomes intersected with religious identity. These also had a link to skin color, in that those who were paler, generally Christians pushed north in previous centuries, were less likely to have Moorish or Jewish ancestors, and thus, quote-unquote, purer blood. This is also where the term blue blood comes from, with all of its class and racial implications. If you have paler skin, then you are able to see more of the veins, that stick out in your body, and the blood looks blue underneath the skin, and that's more evident the paler the skin tone is. Another way in which the early modern ideas of race as bloodline were intertwined with the biology of the day is called humoralism. Medical theory since antiquity, had described the human body as composed of 4 substances or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Given that these are the 4 things that regularly emerge from the body, this makes a certain kind of logical sense. Illness was conceived as an imbalance in these factors. So a cold was due to an excess of phlegm in the body, for example, and cures focused on getting more phlegm out of the body. Each of these humors had qualities. As you can see here, blood is hot and wet, phlegm is cold and wet, yellow bile is hot and dry, and black bile is cold and dry. Fevers were considered the result of an excess of blood and were treated through bloodletting. Other illnesses were treated with purgatives like diuretics, which got rid of excess yellow bile, and so on. Bodies were also considered to have a natural tendency towards one of these humors, which determined one's personality or characteristics. Those who had a bit more blood were considered sanguine. Others who had a bit too much phlegm were considered phlegmatic, and those with a little more yellow bile were choleric, and those with black bile melancholic. Scholars, by the way, were generally considered to have excess black bile and be melancholic, because we spend too much time in cold, dry libraries. And this indicates something, that exterior conditions could also tilt one in one of these directions. So these exterior conditions could link not only to libraries, but more broadly to geography. Those closer to the equator with darker skin also had more blood and had the qualities associated with that character. For example, they were more apt to fight, quicker to take offense, brave, but not always thoughtful. You can perhaps see how this could eventually lead to racialized characteristics of later centuries. Another external quality that affected one's internal humoral status was food, what you put into your body. One of the more interesting books on early modern race published in the last 10 years, called Strangers in Blood by James Herrick, puts this all together to point to a way that aristocratic Europeans became racially anxious in a colonial context. If one's racial identity derived from their ancestry, their blood, which was linked for centuries to a particular piece of land, what happened when they moved elsewhere? So the Earl of Essex is referred to as Essex and not by a family name because his identity is coterminous with the land of Essex. If the Earl of Essex's 3rd son goes to become master of a plantation in Jamaica and eats Jamaican food and lives under the Jamaican sun, does not his very blood change? Is he still of Essex in any meaningful way? Does he still have race in that privileged sense? You can see how the shifting of racial distinctions from this kind of complex of factors to something more simple like skin tone to whiteness as a complex mesh of ancestry, wealth, status, and skin color, what today we call privilege for shorthand, would answer some of these anxieties generated by older ideas of race in the early modern period. Another contributing factor to the shift from somewhat inchoate early modern ideas about race to modern racial hierarchies, which scholars have identified, is the role of race in emerging nation-states as compared to vast empires. As I noted above, large early modern empires ruled by Islamic leaders, such as the Ottomans, the Safavids of Persia, or the Mughal Empire in India, tended to be multi-ethnic and multi-religious. One definition, in fact, of empire is ruling over different people differently. Differences in appearance, religion, foodways, languages, and so on are all expected, and to some degree valued as markers of the extent of the power of an empire, in some sense, in the sense inherited from the classical period, and that's the one practiced by the Ottomans and others. The state is set up to handle such differences judicially and politically, and at times to monetize them. European nation-states, on the other hand, start coalescing and centralizing governance in this period, so that France becomes France rather than a collection of distinct provinces, to take one example. To be French takes on a particular set of characteristics, which are promoted to encourage national unity and the centralization of power under a single monarch. This also has the effect of distinguishing the French from those who are not French. This process is accelerated as the French, English, and others begin to colonize the Americas and to compete against each other in Eastern trading markets. One criteria of national identity that gains in importance as the nation-states centralize across this period and begin to colonize is a modern notion of race. Once again, the Spanish lead the charge on this, as they spend a lot of effort distinguishing Spanishness against any taint of Islamic or Jewish heritage in their people, an effort that then spills over into the elaborate tracking of bloodlines in their empire in the Americas, particularly as enslaved indigenous people die off from European diseases and purchased African slaves take their place, creating at least 3 distinct groups of people all closely interacting each other within the bounds of the empire. And unlike with the Moriscos and Marranos in Spain, indigenous and African people cannot simply be expelled from the territory. Their labor is critical to its functioning. So this loops us back to the questions I posed at the start of this section as to whether modern racial hierarchies were developed in response to labor needs or whether they existed prior to the transatlantic slave trade and simply evolved. As you can see, this is a complex and dynamic area of research in Renaissance studies, and not one likely to be settled anytime soon, particularly as new evidence keeps surfacing. A good way of following some of these developments, if you're interested in this, is to access the public parts of the Race Before Race series of online events being sponsored by the Arizona State University Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies. Most academic talks given at universities are free and open to the public, of course, and now that many of them are likely to be held online, it will be easier to access events that are geographically remote, so you might want to keep an eye on this site. And that closes part 3. And now briefly to conclude with part 4. So one thing you may have concluded out of this discussion of race in the early modern period is that simple binary divisions of black and white and self and other are no more unproblematically applicable in that period than they are today. The earliest forays into studying travel narratives and literary works that treat foreign peoples tended to use theoretical tools borrowed from post-colonial studies in later periods, which look to highlight the way European empires in the 18th to 20th centuries, such as the British Empire, not only oppressed colonized peoples physically, politically, and economically, but also how those oppressive systems were justified through racist ideologies, such as, in this case, Orientalism. Post-colonial studies developed methods of reading colonial documents against the grain, as it was called, to show how these racist ideologies worked. Early modernists initially did similar things. You can still see plenty of scholarly articles and books using these methods. to show how early modern texts displayed the development of these racist systems. However, historians quickly pointed out some of the problems with this approach. For example, in the early modern period, European countries are weaker than Eastern, in quotes, empires militarily, economically, and culturally. In fact, in this period, the Ottoman Empire was conquering Europe, not the other way around. Just as many quote-unquote Western Europeans are captured and enslaved by North African pirates operating in the Mediterranean, as Easterners, in quotes, are enslaved and forced to serve in Europe. The balance of power is simply not in the West's favor. This dynamic is beautifully captured by this painting. It's done by a painter at the court of the Mughal Emperor, Shah Jahangir I, and you can see him sitting in the center there. The title of this painting is generally considered to be Shah Jahangir preferring the Sufi sheikh over worldly rulers. So this is the Shah here, this is the Sufi sheikh, and this right here is the Ottoman Sultan, and as you might perhaps have recognized, this right here is James I of England. And this is a quite accurate image because it came from a portrait that the English ambassador gave of his monarch to Shah Jahangir, who promptly took it, gave it to his painter, and worked it into this painting here, showing how James I is going to be ignored by this ruler who prefers to focus on his religious devotions. So while it may be perfectly possible to see an English writer depicting the Turks as scary, violent, other, Elizabeth I was still the one in desperate need of military aid from the Ottoman Empire to protect England against an attack from Spain. Other Turks, others the Turks might be, but they were others with whom military alliances were both possible and desirable. One early modern article worth highlighting is that by Nabil Matar, who you saw earlier as a translator on one of the works that I brought up. He's a major figure in this area of Renaissance studies. He's an English literary critic, but he also reads Arabic and worked extensively in North African sources from the early modern period. He wrote a piece entitled The Question of Occidentalism in Early Modern Morocco, in which he compared European and North African sources and asked whether there was a qualitative difference between how each set of sources treated the other side. We're familiar, I think, with Orientalism. Was there any equivalent incipient Occidentalism on the other side? He came to the conclusion that there was not. North African sources, while they could express fear and revulsion for the Christians of the North, did not tend to dehumanize them by referring to them as animals, and they recognized the legitimacy of Christianity as a religion of the book, even if they thought Islam was superior. And of course, there were many Christians that lived as their neighbors within Morocco and Ottoman domains. The opposite, of course, is the case in Christian sources. So this use of early modern non-European sources was relatively new in Renaissance studies at the time, but now it's recognized as a desirable method of studying the period. This widening of the scope of Renaissance studies in general, beyond the confines of Europe, became known as global Renaissance studies, or in history as early modern world history. I believe you have heard or will be hearing from one of the founders of Global Renaissance Studies, Jyotsna Singh. Jyotsna has worked not only to incorporate European accounts of non-European peoples and cultures, and India in particular, but also to pull in sources written by early modern actors who were not European. Others have worked to include Ottoman, Persian, Moroccan, and other non-European histories and source texts into their teaching and research. Although desirable, this presents some challenges to our field as well. Most of us are still trained as Europeanists. We're not given the opportunities to learn non-European languages, and as university language departments are repeatedly cut during challenging budget times, those opportunities continue to shrink. The number of published translations of non-European texts are few, and many still exist only in manuscript. Wealthy European libraries have digitized almost all of their print holdings from this period by now, and they're in the process of digitizing manuscripts. Comparatively poor North African and Middle Eastern libraries don't even have their entire collections cataloged or those catalogs digitized and online. There just haven't been the resources, either monetary or scholarly, that have been put into non-European archives. There are some individuals who do manage to do this, however. Nabil Matar is one. Sanjay Subramaniam, who coined the term connected histories, from which this institute takes part of its name, is another. Subramanian suggested that the interactions one sees in this period are far from displaying the simple binary dynamic of East and West or self and other, and instead show myriad different types of unexpected connections. He studies figures who wander across the early modern globe in surprising ways and who paint the peoples they interact with in various ways, sometimes as hostile others, sometimes as long-lost brothers, sometimes as shrewd business partners or competitors, sometimes unexpected allies, etc. Instead of looking for differences, Subramanian highlighted cross-cultural connections or entanglements, as they're often called, and other scholars, of which I am one, have followed in this path. Unlike Nabil and Sanjay, however, I do not have the language skills to do this on my own, so I and others like me have begun to work collaboratively on global Renaissance projects. This is not the traditional method for humanities scholars, where research is nearly always a solitary pursuit. But European universities and grant agencies have begun encouraging collaborative models, and individual scholars like myself find ways to do such work here in the US as well. So I gave you one article co-written by myself and an early modern Ottoman historian examining a travel tale by an Englishman who went to Persia, this is the Shirleys again, at the start of the 17th century. So we follow Subramanian's method here in noticing the similarities that Shirley takes pains to highlight between the Persian and the English courts. So far from painting the Safavid court as radically different and inferior, Shirley instead seeks to make the two cultural formations kind of commensurate for his own particular reasons. He wishes to use his travels to Persia to improve his chances of climbing up the ladder at the English court or another European court, and so he writes an account that emphasizes how the skills that he successfully displayed in the Persian court are similar to those needed in an English court. So this emphasis on connections, which can be positive or negative, opens up the field for a variety of different types of accounts of intercultural exchanges and interactions in the early modern period. Some are definitely violent, domineering, and bear the marks of racist imperialism of the later centuries. But some are definitely not, and the focus on connections allows for both to be studied and discussed. Another set of approaches taken primarily by early modern and world historians is to shift away from a focus on national identities or one-to-one exchanges and instead make the object of study something like global trade networks and flows, which are almost always multi-ethnic, multilinguistic, multi-religious, and require significant cooperation to work. Some write environmental histories, for example, of particular areas which over time are used, lived on, traveled over, and differently regarded by many different peoples. Some write an environmental change of a broad area over time, like deforestation, which was rampant in this period, or invasive species, which happened as well. So travel narratives provide a critical source of evidence for all of these approaches, in addition to other types of documents. These studies will also venture outside the textual evidence and into more archaeological realms as well. So all of the approaches to early modern or Renaissance studies that I've outlined here are a dramatic departure from older modes of conceiving of the period and of what constituted a legitimate way of studying it. Widening our lens to include the entire globe and all of its varied interactions has opened endlessly fascinating avenues for continued research, particularly through collaborative partnerships. It's also changed many of the old notions of what constituted Renaissance, down to the use of the word itself. As one of my colleagues who studies China at this time once told me, "You study what? The English Renaissance? When is that? Oh, right." We ought to really just refer to that as England in the late Ming or early Qing period. So you may consider rebranding your classes. Thank you for your time, and I'd be happy to follow up on any of the material that I had here in the Q&A session.
I'm really happy to welcome Professor Julia Schleck, who gave us that great lecture. Again, one of the literary scholars that has informed our work this week. And so I'm planning to do, in connection with this, some sessions. And we started doing travel narratives yesterday, and we're going to do some more travel narratives today. And I've brought up some excerpts from that are out online from Hakluyt and from Ogier de Busbecq, and a couple of other things that I've put into the folder. We have a Google folder that collects various things, various documents as we're going along this week. So I've made a folder actually of Renaissance travel, and before we join the breakout groups later. But in the meantime, the major thing for this morning is to have a Q&A discussion on the fascinating lecture by Professor Schleck. And so I will be happy to take questions, raising hands electronically, putting you on gallery mode, and you can wave your hands in the air if you like. We've been trying to run this fairly informally. Are there any hands raised already? Yes, we do. We have Jean Trabulsi. Good morning. Unmute thyself.
Good morning, Dr. Schleck.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for your work against racism in the classroom using literature. I was fascinated by the exercise in which 4 students told one student described an animal they'd never seen before. I'm wondering if you can tell us how that worked and what the goal of that exercise was, please.
Yeah, certainly. So part of it, of course, is mimicking what travelers would have come across. So in some sense, it's a historical reenactment and a small way of what someone, a group of sailors from Europe, seeing an armadillo run across their path might have thought when they saw that. So on a most basic level, what it's looking to do is just provides a more realistic sense of what it's like to run into an animal that you have no name for, that you have no way of knowing whether it's friend or foe, whether it's edible or not, what it might do to you, how fast it is. But also then the point of the exercise ultimately is afterwards, when the students have finished trying to describe the animal that they have a picture of, but the person drawing it does not, is that it also gives them sympathy for the strange early modern pictures, which are printed in books and don't look like the animals that they're purport to describe. And so, it gives some kind of sense of the difficulties of rendering something that's entirely new, in part because the way the students inevitably end up describing it is through metaphors, through things that they already know. So they'll look at one of these electron micrograph images of a bug, which is usually what I give them, and they'll say, that looks like a spiky giraffe, which might be a kind of friendly thing. Giraffes aren't dangerous to humans, and so it indicates, a kind of one sort of behavior and attitude towards the animal. Others might look at it and say, that looks like a spiky cockroach, in which case, the answer is, like, ugh, step on that thing. Or, like, depending on kind of what metaphors they draw, it indicates, like, it positions them to take a particular action towards the animal that they're looking at. And what I want to draw out of them is to say, when you're describing something entirely new, you always fall back on the old. And depending on what old thing you look at, or that you're comparing it to, it conditions your response. And so when you're looking at these travel narratives, this is the same with people. When they look at a man and a woman standing next to each other, and they see the woman and they say, and I spoke to, the king and his wife, then that carries with it a whole series of assumptions about the social organization of the people that they're in contact with. It could be that, that the woman was the spiritual leader of the community and the man was her assistant or son, or, like but the minute, you know, those metaphors are made and travelers are often guessing because they don't know, then it conditions kind of a whole set of social responses as to what one should do with the people or the animals that they're hitting for the first time. So what I'm looking to do is draw out those metaphorical responses and tie them to actions that no knowledge can be that's new can be kind of entirely understand as 100% new. It always gets related to the old.
And the exercise itself, the three kids have the same picture, is that correct?
Yes.
And the three kids with the same picture talk to the one kid who has to draw it.
Yes, who can't see the picture.
I see. Well, I think it's a great idea. I think I'm going to use that. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. It's a lot of fun, of course, especially if you find really creepy looking bugs, you know, that nobody looks at because they're too tiny or something.
Right, and some of these sea creatures that are being found in the great depths and so on. Yeah, no, that's a great way to approach it. And we've been talking all week about things we can do in sort of the flipped classroom, you know, online, where we have kids reading the narratives and doing collective learning processes, but then doing really active learning things in the times that we're together. So that's a really great idea.
Yeah, that one would definitely work remotely. I mean, you could email the image to 3 of the kids, and you know, the other one would not receive it.
Right, exactly.
And then you can, of course, hold them up at the end.
Right, exactly. Do we have hands up or electronically, whiteboard, whatever those things we can use on Zoom? Hands up. If not, while I'm waiting for more hands to go up, I want to just remark that in the collective body of the lectures that we've heard this week, that how could we ever possibly have taught the Renaissance as an insular European phenomenon? You know, it's only mildly, you know, just on the face of it, coincidental that, you know, this period emerges as Europeans go out and extend their geographic scope. And last year in the Summer Institute, we did the Enlightenment, and similarly had been treated long time in standards, in many other ways that we teach from textbooks, certainly, as an insular European phenomenon. And it's fortunately, we're just kind of taking that now out of the range of even possibility. Of course, it's up to you teachers to implement that and influence, you know, your colleagues by giving them materials and ideas and sort of irrefutable ways of looking. Now I see a bunch of hands go up. Katie Scorza, and I think Lucia had her hand up, but it seems to have disappeared. Oh no, it's back again. Okay, Katie?
Hi, I really enjoyed your lecture, and you began with the anecdote about when you're discussing Othello in your classroom and how some students will refer to Othello as African American. And I understand how your entire lecture was, in essence, a response to how to address that. But I was just really curious about how you respond to those students in your classroom. And I'm also wondering about, I think it's traditional to cast a Black actor as Othello, and how that sort of, maybe that's what leads students to draw that inference?
Yeah, interestingly, the students will often do that even after I've, I tend to teach, to approach this play when I'm teaching it embedded in its historical time rather than in its performance tradition across time. I do have a colleague who does adaptations, and he tends to kind of trace, you know, particular productions across time. And I know he's done great work with Othello along those lines. So I will end up spending, you know, like a whole class period discussing the early modern Mediterranean and Moors and what the word Moor refers to at the time. And we'll talk about other texts that talk about Moors, and then it will come up in discussion. And so it's actually just it's almost a verbal tick for them. Like they have had, you know, a whole hour discussing how, you know, America is not even on the scene at this point, but they will still refer to Othello as African American. Because they have such a firm linkage in their minds between skin color and that word in a way, or they'll use Black. And that's almost a little more helpful because that's something that's used in the period. And so we can keep kind of talking about it. when it happens, it will depend for me as a teacher, whether I like highlight it or just kind of give a quick correction and keep going, depending on how much time we've spent on it or how critical it is to the interpretation of the lines that we're talking about at that given moment. If I say like, interestingly, you know, like, of course, Othello's not, you know, like African American, right? He's African. And so how does that change how we read this, you know? And so just to try to give it a kind of positive reminder of how would Shakespeare's audience have thought about that? Because if you ask them to put themselves in the position of Shakespeare's audience, then it reminds them that like, oh, actually they're in England, first of all. So it dislodges the automatic, we're all in America, so we all look at this and like anything dealing with race in a particular kind of set pattern.
It's really hard to get past that too. These barriers, these things that are set up to talk about it, to, you know, interact with people of so-called different races and so on. Jennifer Cross has her hand up, then Lucia, and then Kelly.
I really was intrigued by the conversation you had about the arc of racism, and bringing to our students this understanding that there were those who were anti-racist, who like pushed back against the things that sometimes their contemporaries are doing, such as Lacassus, you know, and that was really, it's one of the conversations I've had oftentimes, because my students, when we talk about, for example, what happened in South America, what happened with Columbus, and sometimes they're horrified by just, you know, the cruelty, and they sometimes they can fall back into, well, that's just the way that the people were at the time kind of concept, and I like to bring up like this whole point of there were those who chose not to be racist, in every time. And so I loved that arc really gave me this like picture of the empowerment we can give to our students, that it's a choice and they can be.
I was going to say, and it's one that, you know, it's great that you highlight those kinds of people and choices, because that can also help move white students past the association of talking about, you know, race as about white guilt, or it avoids like triggering that response, right? To say like, no, actually there's another kind of heritage that you can claim here, and think about like, well, if I'm going to be like these other people in the past, what does that mean for me to do that today? And to look at like, who were those people and how did they fight at the time, and how can I fight now? And so, you know, rather than, you know, students who are resistant to this can collapse it all into like, well, I guess the lesson is all white people used to be bad, right? And you want to like push against that idea that, you know, there are choices to be made in each of those times. And the Renaissance, I feel like, is really useful for that. And the Las Casas is fascinating because the Spanish are, you know, of course, incredibly violent and notorious for the way that they colonize Central and South America. And the fact that there was an actual extended debate on whether the Native American, whether it was fair, whether it was just to enslave the Native Americans. Like everyone just assumes, well, of course they were evil and they thought that back then, but no, they had a long argument about it. There's also really fascinating arguments over land. There are extended discussions in the period over what legal right the Europeans had to take American land. And there's a number of people that articulate the position that they had no right to do that there was no legal like justification in the period that allowed them to claim that land. And there wasn't, legally speaking, for them. And so there are some that are just like, well, it doesn't matter, we just take it. And then, but that's actually a minority opinion. A lot of them are really looking for legal justification, and some of them are honest to say like, no, actually it doesn't exist.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that for me was that the morality of the humanity, like that it existed, and it wasn't like, you know, the morality button got turned on sometime in the 20th century or something, you know, like
right.
That the human state was that we can we can be called upon to speak to that morality and be held accountable for that morality, regardless of the time period we're in. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. I saw someone posted the Alwaleed debate link. That is it, and it's fascinating. Thank you.
I'm reminded of a piece that I came upon when I was researching for the Indian Ocean and world history, the concept of nulla terris. There's a sort of trajectory that actually Joan, who's with us, Joan Brodsky-Shore, helped write a lesson on that. You know, whose sea is it anyway? The whole idea that the Pope could, in a papal bull, grant all this land and territory to the sons of the, Prince, what's his name, Henry the Navigator, and then, you know, the Treaty of Tordesillas. Okay, so you get the other half, and this kind of crazy stuff. But I ran upon this Hugo Grotius's work in trying to break down the idea of, you know, that was based also on the Reformation. But then I found this nulla terris thing, where there was a group of people who in Australia who wanted to purchase land from the indigenous people. And the governor of that territory said, no, you can't do that because this is no man's land. And completely nullified, you know, any claim that any of those people had living on the land. What shocked me was that that was not rescinded until the early 1990s. That was still on the books. And what,
Wow.
in following upon, you know, what took place in South Africa. So, I mean, just, you can go find it if you look up nulla terris on the Indian Ocean and world history maps, I think it was from the 19th century. It's just shocking how the legacy of these things is enshrined in so many ways. And yet based on precisely what you just brought up about the choice that was made by one group versus the other who had the force of law as a governor in Australia.
Yeah.
We have Lucia.
Hi, good morning. Thank you so much for your article and your video. And I really appreciated a couple of the points, and I was hoping you could expand on them, and then I have a question. So the 2 points were that racism sort of was exacerbated by the emergence of nation states versus the idea of racism and racial differences in empires. That was really interesting, and I was wondering if you could just expand on that a little bit. And then the other idea was the idea that racism as a social construct, like this contemporary view that we have of racism, was basically a result of the need for labor, as opposed to it being the other way, that inferior races were more fit for certain labor and such. So I found those 2 points really interesting, and I was just wondering if you had traced any nation statehood, and I mean, are you thinking like Hitler or in terms of how the building of a nation state is a representation of racist ideology, as opposed to there being less racism in a large empire like the Ottomans or the Mughals?
Right. So partially this is an observation of the way that the empires of the time worked, and they're gradually replaced first by the kind of European overseas empires that the Spanish begin, which operate a little bit differently in terms of labor and the different races that live within them. And then of course, those are tied to a particular like home nation state. And so in Europe, like this is the moment when there's a lot of everything prior to this period, and the medieval period is intensely local. And so strangers and foreigners, in fact, the word foreign doesn't mean someone from another country. It basically means like somebody who's not from your hometown. And so it's the idea of difference is just like it's a tiny, tiny patchwork of a million little locales. And you can see that I used France in part because the regional distinctions are still very clear. You can see them in like food and wine and things like, you know, Brittany was its own place from Navarre, which was its own place from Alsace, which was, and they all had very strong regional distinctions. They all had strong regional rulers. And that was the primary mode of identification. You would not say I'm a Frenchman. You would say I'm an Alsatian. And that was the meaningful personal, cultural, and what we would call racial identifier. And so, you know, anyone from far away, they could be from Spain or they could be from Africa, it didn't matter, they were just foreign, all of them. And so the coalescing of the polity around a single ruler meant that you had to find something to bind people together. And one of the things was to say, well, we are French, and that is different from Italian, and that is different from Spanish. And so to start taking kind of, to find others, basically, right? To find people against whom you could define this new block, this new identity of Frenchness. And one of the easiest ways to do that at this moment when people are traveling is to like, well, we're coming across people that are really different. And, you know, like they are definitely not French, you know, like in all of the ways that, you know, we might elaborate, and that helps us understand what it is to be French. And so partially, you know, like that's the procedure that I'm tracing in terms of stronger national identities create stronger boundaries against kind of larger blocks of people. You know, they're started to conceive in kind of much broader terms in that way. Whereas empires, coming out of, you know, the classical empires of like, you know, the Roman Empire, they, and the Ottomans picked this up after they kind of conquered the Byzantines, that they are looking actually to rule over huge swaths of land that by definition have tons of different kinds of people in them. And it is a mark of your fame. It is a mark of your power if you have lots of different people ruling peacefully and who are peaceful and prosperous under your rule. If, you know, like you can control them and tax them and, you know, like, and have them not resist your rule. And in fact, that will allow you to kind of push the boundaries of your empire further so that you are in charge of more land and more people and more taxes. And so those older empires are in a way looking to incorporate different people. They're not looking to define themselves against. The ruling class within them definitely would. You know, like the Ottomans, who were interestingly a multiracial group. They came from all over that empire. And so in terms of skin color, some were white, some were black, some were formerly Venetian and had been captured. Some were coming from the Caucasus or from, you know, like practically from Afghanistan, from like Dagestan. Some were coming from Egypt. But they, you know, they defined themselves as Ottoman, as the rulers of that empire. But it didn't mean that they were looking to exclude, you know, even though they were Sunni Muslims, they were not looking to exclude any Christians, any Jews, anyone who had, you know, different cultural values or looked different or dressed differently than themselves, because partially the idea that all of those people acknowledged that they were their overlords was a mark of status. So that shifts with Spain, because when they attempt that kind of model. You know, they say, hey, you all of you people living here need to accept us as your overlords. But that means that you're going to produce for us. You're going to produce agricultural products. You're going to produce wealth from mines, that kind of thing. And the problem for the Spanish is that, you know, all of those people die out from the diseases that they bring with them. You know, there's a staggering genocide of, you know, up to, and you know, there's huge debates over what the percentages are in the period, because it's very difficult to count. But, you know, some historians estimate up to 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas dies eventually upon contact with the Spanish. So suddenly, like, there are no people that you're ruling over, right? And no one is there to plow the fields and to work the mines. And so you import labor. And some of that is initially indentured servitude and the poor of their own countries. But you know, that's a drop in the bucket compared to what they want or need in terms of exploiting the natural resources there. And so they turn to the already established slave markets and they expand those. And then they push further and they say, well, you know, the slave markets in North Africa they get their slaves from further south. And those people say there's an endless reserve of slaves there. So why don't we just go directly there and start up? You know, like our own base, so we don't have to go through the middlemen in North Africa, and instead we can just kind of import labor straight from the west coast of Africa further south, and that begins the triangle trade, right? The Atlantic slave trade, in which, you know, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people are imported from Africa into the Americas. And that's a different model, right? And it's one that the French and the English mimic in their own empires.
There's a wonderful book by Shugata Bose called 100 Horizons that explores the idea of labor movement and two other ideas. One of them is the concept of empires that exercised a more loose sovereignty versus nation states which established this hard sovereignty of exclusion. And I was thinking as you were speaking about the way in which our textbooks and other materials define nationalism. As you know, or what the nation is this homogeneous, and it only obviously aspires to be homogeneous in language, religion, ethnicity, and these other, and territory. But in fact, the definition itself is an insidious endorsement of the kind of potential ethnic cleansing that happens under this hard sovereignty, and we're still living with that awful situation today, even getting worse. Better, we should lean toward defining nationalism for students and the nation in the way that Benedict Anderson does as imagined communities, and sort of look at what are those markers, how does it even happen? I think that's extremely important, and you know, it's one way in which race can be addressed, I think, indirectly in the classroom, but in that fundamental way. Sorry, we have questions by Linda Burns, and Kelly has her hand back up, and then Maureen.
Hi, thank you so much. My head's kind of exploding with lots of ideas, so this question might be a little all over the place. But so as I'm thinking about this, I'm one, interested in how these ideas of race and nationalism that are arising out of colonialism, if that's even a correct, I'm actually wondering if that's a correct way of describing what you're saying. If there's a sense that I mean, I know there's a question of whether colonization is a nationalist act, right? Like there's a lot of, like there's some historians who say it is a form of nationalism. And so there's that, but that the fact that it becomes a colonial system in a way, as opposed to imperial, in the sense that most of the Native Americans in most of the areas, not all, but die out and are replaced, whether that contributes to the formation of nationalism. So that's one of the questions I have, whether that's an accurate thing to say or what that relationship is, because this is this period of the very sort of nation states, the rise of new monarchs and blah, blah. And then also what that has to do with the creation of an identity of European, which is also arising during this time and is distinct from, like, I'm French, I'm Spanish. It sounds like there's also this sense of like, oh, those people are not European. So there's that definition too. So I'm sorry, that's not very clear, but hopefully you can do something with that.
Yeah, so I may kind of redirect and clarify in a moment, but like to take the second point last, that is definitely true, that like the same thing, the same kind of dynamic that you can trace on a level of nationalism in which the identity is defined by an exterior is happening with Europe more broadly. As you say, like if your primary definition is, you know, like we are English versus the Dutch, then you're not thinking of yourselves as European. But the minute that, you know, you as Europeans are traveling far outside those borders, and the people you're talking to, you know, like even going to the eastern side, to the Levant, the eastern part of the Mediterranean, all of the people coming from Europe, and especially Northern Europe, were just called Franks, like, because that came out of the Middle Ages, and, you know, like, it was, those were the Crusaders. We are just going to lump them under this one term, which is essentially like the French. So they're just all like, you're all French, from the perspective of the Ottomans there, the people that are living there. And eventually they start subdividing into different kinds. But that pushing beyond the boundaries into other places makes you kind of say, yeah, actually, maybe there's some broader identification that we can do. And they do have roots in classical geography, which divides things out by continents. And so you'll see, I think some of the images I included in the lecture included women who are representing the continents. And so suddenly representations of like Europe versus Africa versus Asia versus now the Americas starts working their way into the artistic symbolism of the period, in which the idea of a Europe that represents something in particular comes into play. And in fact, this links as well to theories of racial difference, because they use the biblical idea of Noah's sons and the curse of Ham. So one of Noah's sons, right, is in the biblical story is cursed for seeing his father naked, and he is told that he will serve the other brothers. And this story is mapped onto the continents to indicate that one of them is designated kind of like the slave area that will serve the others. And originally it's in Asia, and then in the early modern period it migrates to Africa. So the continent that was associated with Ham used to be Asia and then becomes Africa. And so, you know, there's a use of those stories to try to justify continental differences that give a sense of what it means to be European versus African versus Asian. And in terms of the point about imperialism and colonialism, I may kind of ask you to clarify a bit further. So you know, as I understand, like the difference between those two things, in part, you know, imperialism, you can conquer territory and it's conquered, but if you send some of the people from the center of the empire to live in those places, then you're colonizing it. And, you know, as Machiavellian notes, that's the most effective way to hold territory. And so they do tend to do that. That's partially on the like European settlement to the Americas that's driven by population concerns in Europe too. And so, you know, they're looking for a place to push what they consider to be like excess population. And so that's part of what's driving their colonial needs, which, you know, depending on who you're talking about, like the Spanish start with a real imperial drive to conquer territory with troops. The English and the French do not. They establish tiny little toeholds and hope they don't die in their little colonies. And so they're approaching how they're thinking of their presence in the new continent in entirely different ways. But so rephrase for me so I understand what you're trying to get at with that distinction.
So I guess what I was thinking about is when you were making the distinction between sort of Ottoman imperialism and then Spanish imperialism, that version that starts to develop, so maybe colonization was not the right term to use. I think what I meant was that distinction that you were talking about, that the Spanish imperialism is it correct to say that in a sense is contributing to the new sense of national identity that is arising in Europe at that time? So that which isn't happening in the Ottoman Empire, right? There is no Ottoman national identity. And so I'm wondering if it's accurate to say that that's a causal relationship, like that as they then become a different kind of imperialism, right? That is importing people in as opposed to conquering those who are there. I mean, with some exceptions, then is that contributing to a new sort of way of seeing themselves that is a more nation state? Or like, I know there's other causes, but I'm saying, is that one of the contributing causes?
Yeah, and I think it's the geography that's key there, right? Is that the Ottomans, kind of drawing on previous empires, like it's all contiguous, you know, like they just keep extending the borders outward. So there's no moment where there's like a clear distinction that says, you know, well, here's the home state and then here's that other conquered territory. Where, you know, these overseas empires that the Europeans establish in this period and maintain through the 20th century, like they are far away from, you know, what post-colonialists would call the metropole. And so, you know, like there becomes this clear distinction and a hierarchy between those who live in the metropole, the original conquering state, and the conquered territory, you know, the Creole who are born in these new places. And they might come from the lineage of the metropole, but, you know, it starts creating all of these hierarchical distinctions. And it also lends to all of the incredibly elaborate racial charts that especially the Spanish develop, right? You know, the different kind of percentages of mixing between, you know, those who come directly from Spain, those who are Creole, those who are Creole with heritage from, you know, having intermarried with the indigenous people or with African, imported Africans. And so, you know, like all of those heritages start being minutely mapped out in order to maintain a social hierarchy there. And so I do think that the kind of geographical design of those overseas empires strongly contributes to the development of a distinct kind of national identity. And since the Europeans are competing against each other for those territories and those trade routes, then yes, they start saying, you know, to use another example, like, well, we English are superior to the Dutch and you should be trading with us. And there's a distinction between English and Dutch, you people in Java who can't tell that, you know, like we all show up on the same ships and all look more or less the same to you, but really, no, we're different. And this is why. And so they have to kind of, you know, really come up with those distinctions when they're competing against each other as well.
And
So, yes, I think that's fair to say.
Underscores that so much later and soon. Kelly had her hand up.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much for your lecture. It was so interesting. I took pages and pages of notes, and I'm so excited to use them. So thank you. So I did have one question, but now I have two. One, based on the last conversation. So one, I'll just start there, is you had just mentioned something really fascinating about the Curse of Ham and how on maps in representations, it was mapped onto Asia and then it was mapped onto Africa. I'm wondering, do you have specific maps that show that transition, and like what time period would that be in? Because that would be really good for the kids to show, especially if I can compare it to like, okay, we can see the shift of where enslaved people are coming from at the same, you know what I mean, at the same time. And then if I could put the two maps next to each other. So if you have specific maps and be willing to share, I think that would be amazing. That's question one. Question two, on a totally different track, I loved your discussion of anti-racism, and the other thing I loved was your discussion of news and sort of like the comparison to fake news and reliable sources today. And I thought specifically about your discussion of the gentleman who made, usually gentlemen, as we discussed, who made the Grand Tour during this time. And that's interesting because I'd always associated the Grand Tour as like a 19th century thing, and I didn't realize it had started so early. And I guess my question was like, how many people did that? Like, how extensive was it? And then therefore, if those guys are considered the most reliable sources, right? Like, does that mean there was like, if there's not a lot of them, there's like next to no reliable information about, is that what that means? Like, could you expand a little more on the Grand Tour in this period?
Sure. So maps, I will ask I have a colleague who's an absolute map expert who's looked at hundreds and thousands of them who came out of art history, and I will ask her if she has any like good, clear maps that can be shown. I'm a little worried because the placement of Ham in Asia comes more from the Middle Ages, and the maps there are usually T maps. So they don't look like our representational maps. They are maps in which Jerusalem is at the center because it's at the center of the world for them, and then they're called T maps because there's like two obvious rivers that are formed like this on the map, and Jerusalem in the center, and those are like two important biblical rivers, and so like they don't like at all resemble any map that we might look at today, because they're not meant to be representational.
Right.
They represent a viewpoint of the world rather than an effort to imagine what it might look like if you were 1,000 feet above it, which when you think about it, is kind of a weird idea, like why we would consider it to be most useful, even though none of us experienced the world in that way, to think of it like we were birds somehow. And so in any case, there's a big mapping shift that happens in the period. So I will check and see if there's anything, especially that has Ham on there, that's not a crazy medieval tea map.
Even if it is a crazy medieval tea map, I'm happy to explain that to the kids, because that would be a cool like medieval to Renaissance transition anyway. So like I'll take the tea map even. So thank you.
They can be fun, they have a little like red blob on them usually, and you're like, well, that's the Red Sea. So they're very literal about it. And then your other point was, remind me, the
Grand Tour.
Yes. So it does start this early. It's not taken by it increases across the 17th century, so that it's a real fixture by the 18th century. It doesn't tend to go any earlier than I would say like the late 16th century, and that's pretty early. So there's not a lot of people who are doing that, and not everybody writes about it. So it's not that there's like therefore no reliable information. It's just, of course, that there's a hierarchy, and so you work with what you have, and also there's a lot of people who talk to those travelers and use that information, and they combine it with what they knew from previous scholars. And so received knowledge rather than knowledge derived from empirical experience is still considered to be just as important, if not more important, than other forms. So experience and authority still often, sometimes even win out, and are at least as important as like firsthand witnesses. And so things that were inherited that were known about other places from the Middle Ages will still be given a lot of weight. And you can, we find this to be kind of incomprehensible, but I always remind students, for example, like, if you're asked to dissect a frog, like in high school or something, like whose frog ever looks like the book? And like very few of them match exactly those nice clean little diagrams that you get of where all the organs should be and all the rest of it. But you don't say like, the book is wrong. You say, I got a defective frog. Why doesn't my frog match the book? The book is right, my frog is wrong. And they had a similar kind of response sometimes, in that there were authorities and they believed those authorities. And so if people came back and said, no, actually it's totally different, and they're like, well, who are you to challenge the great authorities of the past? So this is a slow crossover, and they made use of both of those past authorities, and if someone were credible enough, they would kind of add the material that they brought back, and it could slowly affect, or it would pile up, right? If you get enough people that you consider trustworthy saying, no, actually this is the case, then it could push back on those older authorities. So it's kind of a messy process in the period, I mean, as it is now. And it's a little hard to assess as well, just because, it's like reader response. We don't have a lot of responses to the way people read books. And so we have to do a lot of extrapolation and guessing and use of whatever marginal notes we can find, or people who wrote letters about what they read, or cite others, for example. So it's partially a lot of extrapolation that we're using.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Maureen, but I just, while you were speaking, tried a Google search of mapping the story of Ham onto Africa. I'm not going to tell you what I found, but try it yourself. It's pretty shocking. One of them has the title, it's on Pinterest, it has the title Children's Church Crafts, and it's pretty blatant. I'm not joking. So anyway, Maureen, on that note.
First of all, great getting such good conversation here. I had a question about first visitors and later kind of imperial powers, those who openly, socially, and sexually interact with the new people they're finding, and those who don't do that, what the effects are or what it comes from.
So when you say those, do you mean travelers or do you mean conquerors?
Conquerors, yeah. Maybe first the travelers, then people who are conquerors.
Yeah, the travelers, there is plenty of evidence for a pretty wide range of interactions, and it depends on who's controlling or paying for the travel that they're doing. So for example, I look a lot in my work at trading companies, and they don't particularly care if their agents who are traveling abroad or living abroad marry or sexually couple with people who are living there or living with them, or like they are entirely indifferent to that in this period, as long as it doesn't affect the economics of the company. So it comes out in company records when someone, you know, marries a second wife in India, even though he already has one in England. And the problem is not even the bigamy. The problem is that the Indian wife is being kept in the company compounds, and you know there is money being paid out to, like, you know, for firewood and food to keep her warm and fed, and so that's considered to be unacceptable. And so if there's an issue that affects the company's profits, then we have a problem. Otherwise, they don't tend to remark on it in this period very much. And in fact, there's a fascinating book, and this is, you know, later, it's tracking the 18th century, called White Mughals by historian William Dalrymple.
Fascinating book, yeah.
Yeah, and so that gives a good sense of the moment when that turns and it becomes racially unacceptable for like the British to be consorting with Indian people, for example. And so earlier on, there just aren't those kind of problems, and you'll find issues in you'll find mentions in like the East India Company records about sailors who bring native wives back, and and it's hard to tell whether those sailors are like white English sailors or whether they're Indian or sailors from anywhere in the Indian Ocean, because so many people died on those voyages that they usually had to populate the return voyages with people who were coming from, you know, wherever they had sailed to. Sailors who are just looking to pick up the next kind of paycheck and get on whatever ship it is. And so there's plenty of kind of examples of the East India Company kind of debating over whether they pay for the English wives of native sailors, because the English wives are left at home and the native sailors had gone back on another voyage back to, you know, the Indian Ocean. And so is it the responsibility of the company to keep up the maintenance of those wives? You know, like, so like there's evidence in the records that there's plenty of intermarrying, especially as you go down the social hierarchy. And that's true, you know, that gets noted in books like, I think I mentioned Herbert Aptheker's, who talks about the frequency with which there are like what we consider racial intermarriage and things like that. It gets more common as you go down the social hierarchy. And so that, you know, like that, for those travelers, not a problem. For other travelers, you know, if you're the chaplain on that voyage, probably not. You know, you're higher status, even though you're allowed to marry if you're a Protestant, it would be frowned upon. So I mean, like the higher up the kind of ranks you go, if you're doing a grand tour, if you're like the third nobleman son or something like that, third son, you're definitely not supposed to be intermarrying with, you know, the Egyptian woman that you met. But that's partially just in terms of strangeness and what we would consider class, and, you know, not what we would call race. And of course, those two things are very complicated relationship in this period. So it's hard to separate them out. In terms of conquerors, there's of course way more rape than intermarriage. And that's part of what produces offspring. And so what to do with those bastard children becomes a question for, say, the Spanish conquistadors, who, you know, do this rampantly. And there's an interesting work by a man in Peru who is the result of such a liaison, and he writes an extended account of Peru from the kind of Peruvian native perspective, and has it published in Europe. And I'm trying to remember the exact name. It has a kind of a long title, but I would be able to call it up and email it to you. But in any case, you know, like some of those children end up being treated as heirs, sent back to Spain for an education. Some of them are simply denied, and are, you know, left to work as slaves in the mines, for instance. So it was kind of depending on the local context, and also just on the local availability of women. You know, if you're a conquering nation, you primarily send men. And so those men are looking for sexual outlet, and, you know, they can find it among that they have there, but, you know, many of them are also just voluntarily or not having liaisons with the women who live there. And then the question of what to do with those kids is one that's handled differently in every case. Eventually there's that elaborate chart, right? Like traces everybody's racial background. And so it becomes ever more codified and ever more problematic as time goes on. And that's a basic narrative here, is that there's just less tracking and less concern about this, and that increases through the 17th into the 18th, and by the 19th century, we hit kind of like the nadir of race relations in terms of interactions between Europeans and other peoples.
Okay, so my question is, it seems that we have come to a consensus, so to speak, that the Atlantic slave trade, travelers, the rise of the nation state, all of these were significant contributing factors to this emergence of the social construct of racism, right? So that leaves for me a big elephant in the room, which is the caste system in India, because the idea is that for millennia, with the Indo-European, this is like history, Indo-European migration, with the establishment of the Vedic traditions coming down from northern India, and they brought with them this, or imposed this caste system on India, which was, integral to the society. And I kind of wish Dr. Singh was here, but she's not here. And so my question is, to what extent did the Mughal Empire successfully, and I don't even know if you know this, but this is really the elephant in the room, because it's the idea of codified racism based on skin color that predates the early modern period. So my question would be, did the Mughal Empire, which was Islamic, sort of decrease the potency of the caste system in Europe, even though I know that the Mughal Empire was really only in northern India? It didn't even penetrate down into the lower kingdoms. So what do you think about that?
I do not know enough about the way that the caste system is designed to know that if it is predicated on color, or if it's a far more kind of complex issue of inheritance and social function. My guess is that it might combine all of those things, and that we today use somatic difference, skin and hair and facial construct as a kind of primary marker of difference. In earlier periods, often they do not. They end up, that's one of many things that marks difference, but inheritance from your parents tends to be a much stronger marker, because it indicates kind of where your place is in society, and that was considered less mobile. So in general, we tend to think of ourselves as able to change our major social dividers, or we use class, socioeconomic class, And whether that's true or not is another debate, but like that's deeply embedded for us as a culture. That is not an assumption that most people in the early modern period have, and that's true pretty much like across most of the globe, whether we're talking about the kind of African empires or the Chinese or the Mughals, is that you are essentially born into a certain kind of family person setting, and you're not going to leave that, and that is where you belong. That is your home and your identity. And so if that's the case, then like I would say that probably the caste system has similarities to the kinds of social divisions that exist elsewhere. In Europe, they divide society into kind of three groups, right? There's those who fight, those who pray, and those who work. And the commoners, those who work, are the largest group. But you don't leave the commoner group and become an aristocrat. It's very difficult to kind of move among those three areas. I know within kind of the Chinese empires, this is the late Ming and early Qing period, and they have an incredibly kind of elaborate bureaucracy in how they handle this, and they're about to suffer a series of invasions too, and so they have a far more finely granulated sense of social organization. But I don't know enough about the Mughals to know the impact that they had on the caste system, but I guess I would caution us against kind of looking for places where race as we understand it, like social divisions based primarily on color, skin color, are something that we're unlikely to find, because it's going to be, as it is today, more complicated than that.
Yeah, thank you.
I mean, I'm not in any way, shape, or form an expert on this, but as far as I know, the caste system, of course, it's of Hindu origin, what Hinduism not being one thing, but many things. If anything, it seeped into the culture of Muslim Indians all the way into the modern time, even despite reforms and things like that. So definitely class and somewhat race and religion complexifies the whole thing. But part of that cultural blending was for that to seep in, but also be certainly modified in complicated ways. There's a lot of writing about it if you wanted to look up on the caste system. I think Arundhati Roy, the author we mentioned earlier this week, has written on that and extensively for the modern period, but looking back.
And I'm sure that if you email Jyotsna, she'd be happy to recommend some books on that as well.
Right.
Dr. Singh.
Najla has her hand up.
Yeah, Professor, you mentioned the European slaves taken into Africa and other places. Can you please elaborate more on that? How were they captured? Why were they captured? What would they do in those countries, in those other areas, and how were they treated?
Sure. So that is partially a continuation of the Mediterranean slave trade that had existed since ancient times. And their slavery is based on kind of your bad luck, basically. If you happen to be captured, then it's a bit like being robbed today, but they don't just take your stuff. They say, great, you're even more valuable to sell. And so you would be taken and brought to a slave market, and one that would where the thieves were based from, and you would be sold. And so that's essentially what happens to Europeans who are taken by pirates in the Mediterranean or along the Atlantic coastline. And the same was true, there's plenty of ships that are based in Europe that take North Africans and anyone else who's traveling. They also would be grabbed and then brought to, slave markets at Marseille and sold as well. So it's a ubiquitous practice that kind of goes on both sides. And in fact, the pirate crews themselves tend to be kind of multi-ethnic and often multi-religious. So they're kind of ecumenical, like whoever they can grab and make money off of, they will do it. And so those pirate crews, in fact, they end up grabbing European sailors who, especially the English and Dutch, have developed kind of more advanced sailing technologies than the old galleys that used to go in the Mediterranean. And so these advanced sailing technologies are imported into the kind of pirate economy, as it were. And so the pirates actually become far more maneuverable and successful at capturing people, which is why there's a big boom in piracy in this period. So if you were an Englishman who happened to just be on a trading ship that gets taken by pirates, and then you are sold in Algiers, then you might be kept for the galleys. And so in which case you would row until you died. And it was incredibly brutal, and people were treated as thoroughly disposable and brutalized and just and thrown over the edge, right? When they ran out of anything that was considered useful in terms of labor. On the other hand, you might be kind of identified as the ship's gunner, right? The one who knew how to man the cannons that start to be carried on shipboard, in which case you become incredibly valuable as a commodity. And so you might be sold to the local ruler, who would then put you in charge of the foundry there in order to cast more cannons. And you would be treated very well because your skills were very valuable. And in fact, you might also be permitted to take work on the side in terms of metal or iron work that you could sell, and you would give a percentage to your owner, but you could keep a percentage yourself. That would improve your own kind of living conditions and eventually allow you to ransom yourself. Some of the people who are captured convert to either Islam if you're in North Africa, or Christianity if you're in Europe, in an effort to improve their conditions, and that does help in terms of the way that they are seen legally speaking. So it can, if you're a master and you have successfully converted someone into Islam, then that's seen as a thing to be celebrated, and it gives you great status. And so that could move masters to lower the price or free their slaves and welcome them into the community with the understanding that they would stay there. And many of them did. And so there's this wide range. Some are sent to farms that are outside the cities and are treated very brutally in terms of their, agricultural labor, similar to the galley slaves. Others become overseers of those places and travel back and forth between the farms and the cities and assist the master in their, writings and calculations. And it kind of all depended on your value, what you could offer, and therefore kind of who bought you.
So could they buy their freedom or not eventually?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, some of them did, and that's how some of the accounts that we have are published, because some of those people buy their freedom and return to England. And when they get there, then everyone takes a look at them and says, you're wearing weird clothes, like you can speak another language, like, are you even Christian anymore? Who are you? And so they write these accounts partially as a kind of defensive attempt to like reintegrate within the community, and often to insist that, like they stayed true Christians in their hearts, and they were always Christian. They don't talk about being English so much, which gets back to our kind of national identity thing a little bit, but they talk about their religious identity very insistently. And some of the slaves escape and then do that. And so we have, these very dramatic accounts of how they manage their escapes from slavery and make it back to England, where they write their accounts. Sometimes there's whole like crews that do that.
And some go native and convert to Islam and become free that way, on a different basis. Karima has her hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, I liked this conversation about Muslims in India, and did they kind of absorb that whole caste system. And one of the things I've had my students do is look at their Muslim magazines now, they're online, etc. And if you look towards the end of those magazines, you will often see families advertising that we are seeking a husband for our daughter, or we are seeking a wife for our son. And apparently every one of their children has at least 18 PhDs. Every one of them happens to be either a doctor or an engineer. But the other thing that comes up inevitably is we're seeking, for instance, a husband for our fair-skinned daughter, who's a physician, blah, blah, blah. And the word fair-skinned comes up constantly. So, if you're asking, is that still an issue? It certainly is, because you can just look at the contemporary magazines right now and the ads at the back of the, and for some reason those ads are always way down at the back of the magazine. But fair-skinned, we're looking for someone for our fair-skinned son.
And there's a big discussion going on now in India about these skin lightening creams. It's a big debate. So, Professor Schleck?
And it's perhaps worth noting that there is, and I highlighted this in my lecture, there is still a significant scholarly debate. Like I've emphasized the role that economics and travel plays in the development of racial identities based on racial difference. There are other scholars who emphasize continuity on this, right? And say like, this is something that had existed in Europe long before, there is any travel outside of Europe, long before the coalescing of the nation state, the American empires. And they point not to social systems of discrimination per se, but to like color associations, or the fact that like the myth of Ham exists, right? And just because it moves from Asia to Africa doesn't indicate that it was any worse, when it was like placed in Asia. And so the idea that there were some, who were natural slaves, that this can be linked to a whole range of negative and positive associations with light and dark, and especially through skin color, which, again, is kind of mixed in with the idea of class, just because it, as I'm sure you're all familiar with, those who work outside are of darker skin, those who can afford to kind of stay inside and protect themselves from the sun, have higher social status. And so fair skin gets associated with economic privilege. But, like there are people, in the field who will very much emphasize that this isn't something that starts, that there is no time before race, that instead, there's simply a mutation over time. And the ways in which the power structures use things like obvious somatic differences changes. And so that is a different thread within the scholarship. It's one I find less convincing, and so I haven't emphasized it here, but I do want to kind of say that it's out there, and you will find lots of good scholars making smart arguments about that. There's a book by Kim Hall called Things of Darkness that does some of that kind of early like association of colors with positive and negative associations, and how that kind of works to solidify prejudices.
Okay, Lucia has a question.
This is also sort of a comment. I live and work in South Florida, and I have for the last 20 years lived here. And when I approach the subject, when we teach about the transatlantic slave trade and the colonial system, and they see the caste breakdown of in Latin America, it's it's very weird for them. I teach freshmen, so they're kind of deer in the headlights anyway, so to then throw this stuff on them and be like, okay, well, here's how humans are classified, it's weird. That's why the context is important. But something that the students themselves brought up to me, I have a lot of kids whose parents either came from Latin America, or they came from Latin America or the Caribbean, especially Cuba, because I'm in South Florida. So they told me, they're like, Miss, because they call everybody Miss now. I don't know if you deal with that too, Miss. And they say Latinos they told me this, are extremely racist amongst themselves. And a similar thing to what happens or maybe it's only Cubans, because I don't know, this is what they're relaying to me, right? But there's this phrase that they use, which if anybody speaks Spanish, it's called mejora la raza, which means that if you marry someone who is lighter skinned than you, then that is going to better the race, mejora la raza. So when they told me this, I was kind of shocked. Like, I'm from upstate New York, and we're raised like that prejudice and racism are like no non-starters. Like you just can't go there. At least that's how in my school, it was. But here they're like, so I was just surprised that it was like part of the familial structure. And that was just my comment. So apparently there's a continuity of this sort of elitism, I would say, that's even present in the descendants, of the Latin American colonial period. And yeah, that's my comment.
Yeah, this is, not only within Latin America, but but more generally, and I've been noticing Robert's comments flashing up on this. Like this is a system that we've inherited almost globally, thanks to the kind of European, like racist European imperial empires of the 18th and 19th and 20th centuries, is that this association of status with skin color. And so it is deeply embedded, not only for like the gross kind of, are you of white or black descent, but all of those gradations in between, that being fairer skinned can be seen as far more desirable. I'm familiar with this more in a Haitian context too. And so there's a way in which certainly within communities that we might, like if you're coming from a white community, you might think, well, there's white and black people, but of course within there can be these kind of senses that it's better to be light-skinned than dark-skinned. That's certainly the case, and I'm seeing throughout Latin America, certainly in Africa. You'll see this in Asia as well, right? This is an inheritance of those European racist empires of those centuries, and it's one that that affects not only kind of cross races, but within racial groups. And so, like in a way, the best thing to say there is not, like that's not just Cubans, or it's not just, that's something that we all inherited, whether we're using that to differentiate between those of Caucasian descent and those not, versus kind of inside groups. We've developed this spectrum that associates light skin with desirability in a whole range of kind of cultural and socioeconomic ways.
Fascinating. Well, we have cleared the queue of people with their hand raised. Does anybody want to contribute something here? Just, shout out. Jennifer?
Okay, so I know this is, but I find it ironic that that white people, at least my teenagers, bemoan if they can't get a tan because they're fair skinned. And and I'm speaking as someone who naturally tan extremely well, and will admire, right? We admire the people with that nice tan, but my teenage kids who are freckled and red haired are just broken hearted that they're so pale. So I just, that to me just seems so ironic.
Yeah, and I think that brings in issues of socioeconomic class too. I mean, as one of those redheads who just fries out in the sun, like I could desperately wish I had a little more melanin, but the association with a kind of beautiful tan and with thinness, right, is also something that's more of a 20th century development, right? It would have been far more desirable to be heavier in past centuries because it indicated your status. Now, thinness indicates your status, and a kind of perfect kind of, you need to be white and be tanned, right? So we're not looking for a tanned black person, right? We're looking for, like, there's a very specific association with what counts as a good tan, right? That matches those social structures in terms of who's on top of the hierarchy.
Summary, we've gone bonkers. Completely but you know, drawing these kinds of things to students' attention is certainly healthy. Anybody else? The evil timekeeper has been thrown to the dogs here, to the alligators. Does anyone have something they'd like to mention? I think we have juiced our scholar, you know, thoroughly.
I actually have one
thing. Thank you so much.
I have one thing that I wanted to say, although Renee, did you?
Linda has her hand up, and
okay.
But go ahead, please.
Oh yeah. Hi, Julia. I really appreciate your work. Thank you for being here. I was absolutely fascinated when you brought up in your presentation about the lieutenant nun, and I was just fascinated where the boundaries lay with cross-dressing at that time. I always try to bring in cross-dressers when I'm teaching, for example, about the U.S. history.
Yeah, that's something that, you know, I highlighted dress as one of the primary markers of identity. It indicates your gender, it indicates your you know, whether you're a commoner or an aristocrat or within the religious ranks. It also indicates your wealth within those. It indicates you know, often your geographical identity. And so like there's just a lot that gets piled on dress in the period. And so if you swap that dress, it's a really profound act. And it's one that seems to have been done with more frequency, both in this period and kind of across time than we tend to think. So there's a number of very kind of well-documented historical cross-dressers in this period. So Catalina de Rauso is one of those. And she almost, you know, and I hesitate to use she, I mean, I should probably go for the they pronoun with this figure, because they seem like a good approximation of someone who is trans in their early modern period, and they're very determined to live their life as a man, and that involved cross-dressing, but it involved a lot of other things too. In England, it's seen frequently, always as a woman cross-dressing as a man. However, because of the gender hierarchy, it made a kind of sense to people to have women aspire to be men and wish to move up in the social hierarchy to gain the kind of privileges and flexibility of movement and safety that men had compared to women. It made no sense to anyone that a man would dress as a woman. And so that happened. That is represented in literature very, very rarely, and always as a form of very high comedy. So like Falstaff cross-dressing in Merry Wives of Windsor is one of the only examples I can ever think of, whereas I can tell you like dozens of examples in literature of women cross-dressing as men. And that's presented in all kinds of ways. There's also a sense in which sex is just, this is another class that I do, right? There is one sex in the Renaissance, not two. And it comes from their understanding of the anatomy, that if a child is perfectly formed in the womb and the woman is kind of well heated and kept kind of warm and happy throughout the pregnancy, the child would develop to the fullest extent of human development and become a male. And part of that was all the sex organs would descend out of the body and hang from the crotch. And whereas in the case of women, the woman clearly like hadn't been properly heated, the child hadn't fully developed, and the sex organs had stayed tucked inside the body. And so women were seen as kind of like imperfect versions of men anyway, to begin with, anatomically speaking. And that also meant that there's just a little more like, there's a spectrum there. So, you know, we have terrible problems with kind of categorizing intersex people today. They did not. They just, you know, they're like, well, that's someone who got kind of halfway there. And there are episodes that are recorded in some of the books of the period where someone will have been raised as a woman and be, you know, running along as a teenager and take a really hard leap over a ditch and land on the far side and find themselves with a penis, and go back to their village, and there's a big kind of hubbub about it. And eventually, you know, doctors and everyone will validate and they'll say, actually, yes, this person can be seen as a man. And in some of those instances, the villages will just offer the person a choice. Do you want to live as a woman? Do you want to live as a man? Make your choice and stick with it. If you go back, we'll kill you, but like you have the choice now. And so, you know, they were just looking for that kind of stability. So they had a little more of a flexible understanding of sex. And that's partially why clothing then takes on this incredibly important role as a marker of gender, right? That in order to keep those boundaries more secure, then things like clothing and social roles gain ever more kind of importance, because the difference can't necessarily be marked on the body as clearly as we who kind of rely on, you know, XX and XY genes or something might fall back on as a way to cleanly differentiate sex. So cross-dressing in the period is more common than I think people tend to think. It's represented intensely in literature, and we have historical examples too. In fact, there's a play called The Roaring Girl by Thomas Heywood, who depicts a woman who cross-dresses in London, who existed at the time and in fact sat on the stage while it was being performed, and you know, was celebrated in the period and not ostracized. So as long as it was a woman dressing as a man, it was okay. It did not go the other way.
Yeah, I was wondering why his life was spared by the Pope. That was just, when you brought that up, I wondered what that conversation was about.
Yeah, I think the Pope would have been more concerned with all the murders committed than with the issue of sex there. And the Pope allows for dispensation. So similar to those villages, you know, he says, all right, you know, if you want to live as a man, that's fine. And partially that was something that they took, they placed a very high value on virginity. So weirdly, you know, Catalina de Arazo, insofar as she could say, I am a Virgo intacta, and have that like validated, was seen to be as a pattern of Christian virtue, like monks, like the nuns in the convent from which she had run away. And so the fact out in the world living as a man and still be a Virgo intacta was seen as extraordinary. And so, yeah, she's given quite a thing that, you know, chose to go back to the continent and become like an obscure mule driver in Panama, right? I mean, like they were not interested in kind of cashing in on that fame or that ability to live fairly well with a pension in Europe. What they wanted clearly was just like the freedom to roam, and they took that.
Okay, I'm going to take the last question. Rochelle Hijazi has been raising her hand, and I saw in chat.
I don't know, my comments are like so like from previous, so further back in the conversation. I don't know.
Go ahead.
If it even matters anymore, but it had more to do with like recently, I found out a student at school got in trouble. This goes back to like skin color and everything. He's mixed himself, but he made some comments about girls of like the darker skin tone. And, you know, they're putting these things online and, you know, so there's still so much conversation about it. And we have all these groups now that are reviewing anti-racist, all those, you know, the books, how to be an anti-racist and how we're going to be, you know, pushing these things more with our students. So it's just, this conversation is just really interesting. And I got halfway through the book before, like the myth of race. I didn't finish it, but I think the whole idea of, you know, how people throughout the world had, you know, known each other as like places of origin instead of skin tone for centuries. And when it really switched over, you know, more of the European standards of our, you know, a certain skin tone being better than another. So yeah, I mean, all the things you guys have been saying, just, it seems so, it's just interesting. And then also into like the Middle East with my husband, being Lebanese, and I've always had a problem when I heard him or them, somebody say the word abid, and I found out, you know, what it meant. Abid they usually would refer to somebody who's Black as abid. The word itself means slave. So it's like a derogatory term. So yeah, just the whole, and it's like, are we ever going to get to a point where we can move beyond, the skin color, in terms of describing each other and putting one group above or below each other? Yeah, just.
And that use of the term is even more weird and reflective of dysfunction, because all of human beings are considered Abdullah, the slaves of Allah, meaning servants of Allah, of
Right.
God. And so, using that term in that pejorative way is utterly absurd from an Islamic standpoint.
Definitely.
So
It's perhaps worth noting, right, that the English word is associated with Slavic, right? I mean, originally it was thought of as an Eastern European kind of Caucasus, because many slaves were captured from the Caucasus due to kind of raids on villages there. And so, the English word kind of points back to a different origin in terms of the way that slavery functioned for Europeans for a long time before it switches over into one that's linked to what we now call race.
And Caucasus being the origin of the word Caucasian, which is even more weird.
Yeah.
Like, hello.
I mean, I think it's important to both highlight that these terms and that they change across time, and that, they're all designed to filter kind of resources and privileges to one group at the expense of another. And therefore, that always recognizes that there's always someone hurt by them. Like, yes, they're constructions, they're things we make up, they're myths, but they also have real impacts in the world. We're doing real work. And so part of when we're teaching and we're complicating those narratives and we're pushing back, then we're weakening the work that those narratives do in the world to hurt people. And so, that's one of the critical functions of teaching, and especially what you all are doing. And this is something that I was in a conversation the other day with other colleagues from the Renaissance Society of America, and and one of the things we were talking about is how to keep working on the fields to do this kind of work, to, because we have colleagues who still associate the Renaissance with the old kind of Renaissance, that, this institute is designed to help people kind of go beyond, and also, implicitly upholding all the racist assumptions of that kind of Renaissance. And so we are having these discussions about, like, well, how are we changing that? How can we, both in the outside world, since the Renaissance, like the medieval period, is often mobilized on behalf of white supremacy, and how can we be pushing back on the impression of what people think of Renaissance, and then how can that work for students? Like, as someone who teaches on the college level in Nebraska, it's pretty white here. Coming out of New York City, it was a real shock to move here. But the students who are not white, who are in my department, don't tend to choose early modern classes. They don't look at Renaissance and say, well, that's a class I want to take. And in part because I think, generally people still think Renaissance, and they think, oh, Michelangelo and Shakespeare and all these other, kind of European white guys. And so pushing back on the idea that this period is somehow only associated with those, that there is, that you can find nothing of yourself unless you're white in this period, is something that needs to start even earlier than college classes. It needs to start in K-12. And, it's that will draw people who are not only white into my classes for all that I do to try to kind of.
And this is what we do. This is where I always say, K-12 world history is sometimes the last stop for students before they go into careers and life. So, so this is what these people do, and I can't thank all of you enough for extending this discussion, and to Julia for really a stimulating session.